Hello, everyone. We have got two talks in one for you today. First, Michael Seibel is going to give a talk about planning your MVP, and then Divya is going to talk about KPIs and prioritization. We'll take a couple of questions from the audience after each talk, so drop your questions in the Slido link that we'll send out in the Zoom chat shortly. All right, Michael, take it away.
Okay, glad to be giving this chat to all of you. Today, we're going to talk about building an MVP. Let me share my screen. And off we go. So my name is Michael Seibel. I'm one of the co-founders of Twitch and also one of the co-founders of a company named SocialCam. I did YC in winter 2007 and winter 2012, and I've worked here since 2013, which is a painfully long time. Today, we're going to be talking about MVPs, otherwise known as a minimum viable product. And a basic definition here is this is the first version of your product. It's the version you give to a tiny set of initial users that you'd like to serve. And it's the version that you start really learning what you're going to be working on and what you're going to be doing. So if I skip to the end, here is the TLDR of this entire presentation. Launch something quickly, then iterate. It's that simple. I'm going to go into so much more detail, but if you just want to get the major takeaway right, launch something quickly, then iterate. So to communicate this idea, this is the Midwit meme, and it's proven to be one of the most helpful tools to advise early stage startups. What's great about this meme is that the genius founder and the idiot founder both arrive at the correct answer faster than the midwit, the hardworking smart founder. The hardworking smart founder will distract themselves with doing customer surveys and fundraising and team building and building out a massive product roadmap and hiring a PR firm, everything that's not building an MVP and launching it. They will convince themselves that these actions will have a significant positive impact on the trajectory of their company. But I promise you that none of these things can have a bigger impact than launching your MVP, talking to users, and iterating. So if you want to be the genius founder, here's what you need to do. First, launch quickly. Use the early momentum that you and your teammates have to get your product out into the world. Second, get your first customers. Oftentimes, the process of trying to get your first 10 customers teaches you so much about the problem you're trying to solve and whether the hypothesis behind your solution is flawed. Next, talk to those initial customers one-on-one to get feedback. Try to understand the pain they have, why they're trying to use your product to solve that pain, and how your product is failing them. And I promise you, your product will be failing them. And last but not least, iterate, improve your product over time. So this seems so simple, but this is the problem. This is the line of thinking that goes through founders' heads. Sure, building an MVP sounds like a great idea, but wouldn't it even be better to make my minimum product something that users would love? Screw that. The product in my head would work even better than that. Why don't I just build a thing in my head? And then finally, I think I'm a product genius, and product geniuses build the perfect product on day one. For example, Steve Jobs and the iPhone. Going through this progression feels unique and interesting to many early stage founders, but what the problem is it's extremely common and extremely flawed way of thinking. What it does indicate, though, are two emotions that all of us had when starting our companies. And I want to dig into these because this is how you don't fall into this trap. The first emotion is fear. Every single founder believes that if they launch something that people don't love immediately, their company will be doomed. Most founders want to spend a ton of time building the perfect product upfront out of fear. And what's interesting is like so many YC founders make decisions out of fear of what happens when things will go wrong. My favorite tactic to attack this fear is to ask a founder to detail specifically how their company would die if their MVP turns out to be bad. The problem is founders have trouble doing this because almost all of the time it's not true. Almost every single time a founder believes their company will be dead when their MVP doesn't work out, they can always iterate their MVP or build a new one. I call this strategy the boogeyman tactic. So when giving advice, I like to think of a founder in their bed late at night, it's a dark room, and they think they hear something in the closet. The typical strategy is to hide under the covers and be fearful until you fall asleep. But obviously the best strategy is to get out of bed, open the closet, and see that there's nothing there. So if there are things about your company or about your MVP that you really are afraid, man, if we do something bad will happen, just take a second to actually write down what you think bad could happen. And I bet it'll be like opening up the closet and realizing boogeyman's not there. Now, here's a second emotion that causes founders to avoid building MVPs. Confidence, specifically overconfidence.
Pretty crazy.
What goes through their mind is, just like Steve Jobs,
like
building
still 9,000 people.
Just like Steve Jobs is building the iPhone, and that iPhone was perfect, I know what to build as well. And so just let me build it. Let me just build the perfect thing. I call these people fake Steve Jobs. They believe the hype and the story behind Steve Jobs, but they don't actually understand what really happened. The real Steve Jobs didn't build the perfect iPhone on day one. Most people don't remember, but the first iPhone had no 3G. So internet was basically not usable unless you were on Wi-Fi. You couldn't take videos with the first iPhone. There was no app store. So all you were using were Apple's crappy native apps. It had horrible battery life. It had no security. So you couldn't use it in workplaces. You couldn't copy paste. It was expensive and the screen cracked easily. That was the quote unquote perfect day one iPhone. So the reality is you aren't Steve Jobs. Steve Jobs wasn't even this fantasy version of himself. And so don't use your confidence to fall into the trap of trying to build something perfect day one. All right. So here is a basic spec for your MVP. And then we're going to follow up with some examples from YC companies. First, it should be very fast to build. It should take you weeks, not months, to get the first version of your product live. Second, it should have very limited functionality. You're actually trying to figure out what is the least that someone needs to get some value. And so oftentimes the best way of doing that is like massively underbuilt as opposed to massively overbuilt. And then you should be targeting a very small set of users. So often I see YC founders trying to get the entire market of all of the users all at once. When the reality is they should be just going after the folks who have the most pain. And they only need the smallest number of those people to get started. So let's look at the first example. This is an early version of Airbnb. What most people don't realize about Airbnb is the following. V1 of Airbnb had no payments. You had to pay the host when you arrived or arrange paying in some other way. It had no map view. You couldn't see literally where the properties were in a city. As a host, you had to have an airbed. How hilarious is that? You actually had to have an airbed. If you wanted to rent out your whole house or even a room in your house, you couldn't do it. You had to have an airbed. And then last, it was only for conferences. They would shut cities down after the conference would be over because the whole theory of Airbnb was we're extra housing when the hotels are already full. So that's V1 Airbnb. Pretty crappy. This is the first version of Twitch. So V1, there was only one channel, The video was incredibly low resolution. We weren't doing streaming video games yet. And it was so expensive to stream live video that we almost went out of business within the first 3 months because of the cost. Finally, a company that everyone knows, Stripe. Back then it was known as Dev Payments. Stripe started with no banking deals, very few features. Stripe had so few features that many YC companies that were further along, like us, couldn't even use it. It was really built for the extremely early stage founders. And then finally, most people don't realize is that while it looked like this amazing API in front, the founders were actually doing manual paperwork every night to onboard new customers and get the damn thing run. So if these MVPs were so bad, how did they become great companies? Why did people use them? What was the core that they figured out? Well, here was a core insight that all of these MVPs had in common. They were solving a hair on fire problem for their users. A hair on fire problem is a common startup term, but most people don't really think about it enough. So I want to work you through a little bit of a thought experiment here. Imagine right now your hair was on fire. Right now, while you're watching this, let's think about if I was sitting next to you and I was a founder trying to solve that problem for you right now. What is the product you would want at this exact moment? I think everyone would say some version of a bucket of water. I took that bucket of water, put it over my head, bam, hair's not on fire anymore. That's perfect product, exciting. What if sitting right next to you, selling you a product, I didn't have a bucket of water? What happens if the only thing I had to sell you was a brick? What would you do? Now, first, a lot of founders say to themselves, well, I would, go find some other solution. I would go try to find someone selling a bucket of water. But remember, your hair's on fire. This isn't something that you can just walk around until you find something better. You want a solution right now. So you know what you would do? You would buy my brick and you would beat yourself over the head with the brick to try to smother the fire. That's an MVP. It solved the problem, but it was basically the shittiest possible way to solve that problem. So if you think about those examples I just gave, all of their MVPs solved a user's hair on fire problem. So Airbnb, two-sided marketplace. For the guests, in the first version of Airbnb, their guests actually bought non-refundable, multiple thousands of dollars tickets to a design conference in San Francisco, only to find out that all the hotel rooms were sold out. So these guests could either lose thousands of dollars on conference tickets they couldn't use, or sleep on an air mattress on a stranger's floor. Guess what they chose to do? For the hosts, the Airbnb founders, their rent had just got increased by their landlord. They didn't have jobs and they had no money in their bank accounts. Hosting strangers on their floor and charging them money was the thing that prevented them from being evicted from their apartment. Both sides had a hair on fire problem. For Justin TV and Twitch, Justin Khan, one of the founders, was the first streamer we served. And he was desperate to get famous. That was his goal. And what's interesting is that crappy MVP you saw caused Justin's face to be on the front page of the San Francisco Chronicle within 2 weeks of us launching, and caused him to be invited to the Today Show in front of millions of viewers. It kind of worked. Was it perfect? No, but he was a lot more famous after Justin TV started than before. And then finally, Stripe. YC startups 10 years ago literally had to spend thousands of dollars and often execute a 3-month biz dev deal so they could simply accept credit cards on their site. Without Stripe, these companies would literally go out of business before they could start charging their customers and making revenue. And so that's why they used a crappy, very early version of Stripe. So with everything I've said so far, I know some of you will still have some doubts. Some of you are thinking, if my MVP is going to suck anyways, isn't it just a waste of time? Why can't I just survey my users, figure out what they want, and then build something they love? Surveys take way less time than MVPs. But here is a non-obvious truth. It is so much easier to understand the user's problem and how to solve that problem when a user is actually using an early version of your product. The issue is that users are so much better at telling you whether your product solves their problem than what set of features would solve their problem. It turns out users are not great product people. They know the result that they want in their head, but they don't have the spec for the product that would solve their problem in their head. That's your job. Even worse, users will often talk about problems they have as if their hair is on fire, but when you build all the features they ask for, they won't even try to use your product because the problem wasn't really that important to them. So don't fall into this trap that just talking to people alone or surveying them is sufficient to figure out what problems they have and how to solve them. Talking to users with an MVP, that is the trick. So here are some hacks for building your MVP quickly so you can start learning. First, time box your spec. Tell yourselves that we're going to build an MVP within 3 weeks or within 6 weeks, and we're going to get the best thing we can do within that specific period of time. That will prevent you from just letting feature creep make that turn into 3 months, 6 months, 9 months. Number 2, write your spec. Be organized. It's so much easier to get work done when you've written down what you want to do, why, and how you're going to measure it. It's so much easier to coordinate with your co-founder when you've written this down. The worst case is to give yourself 3 weeks to build something and waste one of those weeks because you didn't write down what you wanted to build. Next, cut your spec. I guarantee you that the initial MVP spec that you built is not going to fit in the amount of time you've allotted. So after you wrote down all those features and things you want to build, go out there and cut 30, 50% of that. And finally, don't fall in love with your MVP. Remember, it's just a starting point. You should be in love with your customer. You should be in love with your customer's problem. You should recognize that your MVP is a very, very early starting point, and you're going to have to change it massively. So, in summary, build the MVP quickly, get it in the hands of desperate users, folks with their hair on fire. Talk to them and learn exactly why your MVP doesn't solve their problem and iterate until it does. Also, always remember that it's better to have 100 people who love your product than 100,000 who kind of like it. Remember to focus on delighting a small number of desperate users by actually solving their problem. It's most often the case that there will be more people like them in the world. It is very rare to see a YC company who has 100 extremely happy customers and doesn't end up building a great product for many, many more. All right, that is MVPs, and I am happy to take some questions.
Michael, that was awesome. I love the hair on fire meme and the brick example. That's like such a perfect image of what it should look like when people are using your MVP. That's great.
Bricks work, right?
Exactly. So folks here have submitted hundreds of questions, which is pretty cool. I have scanned through them, and there are two big like common threads I want to pull on. So the first one is, what do I do if I'm doing something where it's hard to launch something quickly, like biotech or hard tech or expensive hardware or regulated industry like fintech? How do I interpret this advice from my company?
So here's the short answer. You've chosen to pursue a path that is 10 times harder. And I want to be upfront about that because people in your world might not be saying that to you. One of the advantages of building a software startup is you get to take advantage of this technique. You get to take advantage of learning quickly and testing your hypotheses quickly. So my first piece of advice is, can you figure out how to make this a startup product, a software product? Can you actually figure out how to not use hardware to do this? If you can, great, you should, or at least you should start there. If you can't, man, I don't have great answers for you. I would say that this is a technique that you probably can't use. And as a result, you're going to have to find other ways of testing your hypotheses. early and quickly, because you can make the same mistake, which is like imagining you know the right answer completely erroneously, but you really don't have this technique to use to try to correct that mistake. So figure out another one. Put another way, assume that you don't have the perfect solution in your head. Figure out how to test the hypothesis without, burning millions of dollars or decades of your life.
Cool. Okay. And the second question is, if I'm competing with an entrenched incumbent and they've already got a ton of features, what should I do? Should I launch something that has way fewer features? Should I wait till I have feature parity? How do I think about that?
So one thing that's really funny is this idea of feature parity, right? I think that one thing I've learned working with a lot of YC companies is that you have to fight these battles asymmetrically. The big incumbent in the space is going to be telling customers, we have 200 features and you have 0. And if your whole strategy is to reach 200 users and then launch, you will die. You will lose. Like, it just won't work. So the better strategy is to figure out, is there an angle that is asymmetric? Is there a strategy that allows you to have 3 features, but to be more useful than the products that have 200? And let's be clear, Stripe, I think, nailed this so well, right? Their strategy was, we have none of the features of Authorize.net. But if you're a developer and you want to start accepting credit cards in the next 48 hours, we're the only game in town. So they chose a different battlefield to fight on. And they said, hey, on this battlefield, we've got the best product. And let's be clear, a lot of people thought to themselves, well, the battlefield that Stripe chose was crappy, like early stage startups. Why would anyone want to dominate them? But it turns out that they had insight that that group of people were going to make all of the amazing products of the future. And their insight was that if they could be their initial payment processor and it worked, and they could build new features just in time, no one would want to leave, because who wants to rip out their payment processor? It's a huge pain in the ass. So that insight was correct. And that group of companies that all the incumbents thought were useless and silly, they tend to be a lot of the products that we all use today. So pick the battlefield. Don't pick the battlefield that the incumbent wants to fight on. Pick the battlefield that you want to fight on. And in which case, often just a couple features make the big difference.
Michael, this was awesome. I hope this helped a lot of the more than 10,000 founders on this call realize that they could launch their startup much sooner than they previously thought they could.
All right. Well, great to see everyone. Have a good day.
Cool. Next up, we have Divya to talk about KPIs and prioritization.
Good morning. I'm Divya, and today I'm going to talk a little bit about KPIs and prioritization for an early stage startup. This is my second batch as a visiting group partner here at YC. And while I've worked with hundreds of founders on hitting their demo day goals, navigating goal setting and execution as they search for product market fit, I myself have also been a 2-time YC founder. I've also held leadership roles at several fast growth startups. Just as a heads up, I'm going to be giving you some homework at the end of this talk. My hope is that today we can improve the way you spend your time and expedite your journey to product market fit. So why are we talking about this? Now that you're a startup founder, there is nobody telling you how to spend your time. You might have heard some version of and, not or, implying that you have to turn over every rock and optimize every metric to build a successful startup. While this is true to some extent, you still have to choose how you're spending your time. Ultimately, as a startup founder, you want to get to product market fit as quickly as possible. Prioritization matters, and having clarity on your KPIs is crucial for prioritization. Let's start by defining these terms. A KPI stands for Key Performance Indicator. These are the metrics that you track and report on, both internally and externally. These metrics make sure you're measuring what matters, and they tell you if what you're doing is working. Prioritization tells you what order you tackle your work each day. There are infinite things you could be doing each day, and your work is never done. But time is finite. Prioritization tells you how you spend your time each day, how you direct your team to spend their time each day when you have one. And lastly, prioritization helps you decide which super important things you don't get to today. Here's what your task list may look like. Note that the highlighted items in yellow are the ones that I might decide to prioritize. Also note that every item on this list feels important, yet only a few are likely to truly move your business forward and toward product market fit. In a world where you can't possibly get to everything, you need to prioritize the tasks that'll move you toward your KPIs faster. As an aside, the important tasks highlighted above are actually likely the same tasks that are easiest to accidentally deprioritize in your mind for reasons that we'll discuss later. So why are KPIs and prioritization in one talk? Well, prioritization means that you're working on the things most likely to impact your top KPIs. So it's critical that you choose the right KPIs and then are honest with yourself about which tasks are most likely to move those KPIs. When you're moving fast, it's extra important to make sure you're running in the right direction. I'll use this analogy a few times today, so look out for it. We come across companies all the time who are working so hard, but optimizing for the wrong thing. We call these vanity metrics, things that make you feel good and things that you can brag about on LinkedIn. Amount of money raised, team size, press hits, meeting celebrities as possible angel investors. Unfortunately, none of these things mean you have product market fit. At the end of the day, if you fall into the trap of making these your primary KPIs, you're going to be spending your time on the wrong things. So why are KPIs and prioritization important? Well, as a founder, no one is going to tell you how to spend your time. It's very easy to feel busy and feel productive and not be moving your business forward. Here are some common examples of things you can be doing to feel busy today. Optimizing paperwork tasks, maybe where good enough is all that you needed. Perfectionism and craftsmanship on a feature that nobody's using anyway. Premature optimization or building for scale that you don't need to yet. Or choosing a more intellectually hard problem to solve rather than building what your users want. I remember in the early days of one of my companies, we were trying to pick a legal firm to work with. Sure, you need a lawyer and you need to pick a good lawyer. There are so many to interview, and so many of them wanted to take us out to lunch or to drinks, have us visit their offices, the works. You guys, this felt flattering and glamorous. We felt so busy. But at the end of the day, we hadn't even launched. Yeah, choose a good lawyer. No, this is not impacting your KPIs. Do it quickly and move on. Again, it's easy to run fast, but in the wrong direction. You need to run fast and be running in the right direction. When you're doing a startup, time is at a premium. The faster you get to market, the sooner you earn money, and you can reinvest that money in your business and be less dependent on outside capital. Or even if you want to keep raising, you'll have more leverage to raise money on better terms. Taking more time to get to market means you burn more money. Lastly, moving slowly means that competitors have more time to copy you and catch up. Time spent without making real progress also has an emotional and mental cost and can raise red flags externally in fundraising and hiring. So don't waste time on things that don't matter. So let's talk about how to prioritize. Remember, you'll never finish everything on your task list ever again. As a corollary, nobody's going to tell you what's on your task list in the first place. You're never done for the day, and your list will never be empty again. There are two ways we can talk about prioritization. One is how you spend your time on your startup versus other things in your life. Listen, guys, I can't tell you this. This is a very personal decision. This depends on what else is going on in your life and how you want to spend your time. This is a whole separate topic that we won't spend much time on today. That said, I have two important points. One, remember, speed matters. And two, this is an area where it's really important to align with your co-founder on expectations. We're going to talk more about this on August 1st when me and Kat Lee are going to be giving a talk on co-founder relationships. So for today's talk, when we discuss prioritization, we mean, how do you spend the time you've allocated to working on your startup? Let's make sure that you're doing the most impactful things with your valuable time. Okay, so step one for prioritizing. We're going to talk more about how to set KPIs in the next section, but I want to talk about why this is critical for prioritization. So first, you need to identify your top KPIs. If you've launched, your primary KPI should be revenue growth. If you don't want to make revenue growth your primary KPI, you need to really push yourself on why. We talk more about this later in this talk, but this is important enough to mention here. A non-revenue KPI is rarely the right one, and we'll talk about a few exceptions later. If you're pre-launch, your KPIs in the short term might be weeks until launch or number of conversations with users. But once you do launch, please quickly shift your KPIs to revenue growth. Second, you need to decide, what's your KPI goal for this week? We'll talk about goal setting later, but assume that you have some goal. For example, 10 more paying customers by next week. Make sure this ladders up to any longer term goals that you have. The reason setting the right KPI goals is critical is that it'll remind you of the urgency of growing fast. Early growth compounds, and tracking goals weekly reminds you of this. Here at YC, we talk a lot about the early days of Airbnb, where the founding team wrote their weekly KPI goals on their bathroom mirror, so they were facing that reality multiple times a day. In addition to identifying the right KPIs, you also need to identify your biggest bottleneck or problem in moving your top KPI. Here's an example from a YC company called Super Daily, a daily grocery subscription service in India that sold to Swiggy in 2018. Super Daily faced a scenario early on when they launched V1 of their product. There were a ton of things to be optimized. You guys picture this business. It's operationally complex. The mobile app, ops tooling, inventory management, and a whole lot of messy on-the-ground logistics. But their North Star was growth. And they were able to see clearly that their bottleneck was the conversion of users who actually got pretty far down the sign-up flow and then churned. So they asked themselves, why are high-intent users not converting? That was the biggest problem they needed to solve. And the first tasks they prioritized were conversations and experiments to understand this. By focusing on this question, they realized that high-intent users were dropping out because a lot of users wanted a specific milk brand that Super Daily didn't carry. It wasn't a UX friction issue or an app issue. So they onboarded that milk brand rather than beautifying their sign-up screen. Once they solved this, then they started looking at how to convert users that were maybe farther up the funnel or lower intent, users that were referred by word of mouth or people that were casually checking out Super Daily. So by the time those users got farther down the funnel to the high intent phase, they now had that top milk brand on the app, and they knew that they weren't optimizing a funnel that would leak farther down. By onboarding this new brand, Super Daily was able to increase their conversion rate by 50%. Here's a simple framework to prioritize aggressively to optimize for that KPI goal. Number one, write down any ideas that you might have to hit your goals. Don't start working on them right away. It's really easy to chase shiny new things. Just write them down. Next, you want to rank by probability of success and then sub-rank with respect to complexity or how long it's going to take you to do this task. Pick only a couple of things to try. Once you pick a few tasks and start working on them, if your KPI isn't moving, be really honest about why. Ask why several times until you feel like you can actually understand the real reason, even if it's hard to hear. Per the example of Super Daily earlier, it might be something simple like the milk brand. Do retros in your weekly initiatives. Are you predicting impact and complexity well? Did you complete all the tasks you were expecting to complete in this sprint? If not, next time, break them down more. Give yourself time blocks to reduce context switching. Or maybe, did you accidentally work on some of those fake progress tasks we talked about? Just do better next time. And then move fast, learn, and then do something differently the next time if what you did didn't work. The definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over and expecting different results. Don't let indecision slow you down. Just pick a path and keep moving. Ideally, you're going to be growing fast. If not, talk to a lot of users fast, Churn through your bad ideas fast so that you can get to working on the right good ideas as fast as possible. Don't waste time on indecision. So as a sanity check, here are some things that should and should not end up on your list in most cases. Since we're talking about the 90% case here, and specifically talking about early stage startups, here are a list of example tasks that you should see on your task list. Talking to users, and then building and iterating based on user feedback. When you're spending time talking to your customers and responding to support emails, there is a direct path to revenue growth. The only way you know what your customers want is by talking to them all the time. And the only way to grow is by building something people want. Not much else is going to help you at this stage. Here are some things that should not end up on your task list, AKA fake progress. Passive fundraising conversations or coffees when you aren't actively raising. When you do decide to raise, it should be deliberate, focused, and time-boxed. Conference attendances. Other than a few select industries, this generally won't move your needle at an early stage. Third, arbitrary technical milestones. Spending time optimizing technical benchmarks, launching an Android app. Unless you're hearing clearly from your users that this is a burning pain point, this is probably fake progress at this point. You guys, this fake progress list, it's not anything to be ashamed about. Smart people put these things on their list all the time. We've all done it. These are all tasks that can make you feel good. They boost your ego. They're metrics that you can brag about on LinkedIn. They might make your mom proud. They might make your ex-boyfriend jealous. But what they don't do is they don't necessarily get you closer to product market fit. Here are some common tricks your brain plays on you when you're trying to prioritize. These are tricks and traps that your mind has to help you avoid negative feelings like shame, despair, embarrassment, self-doubt. Here's the first trap. Many people are drawn to low leverage tasks. Why? They provide a sense of accomplishment. They allow you to check things off your list, and it's so tangible. At a time when your startup's future is uncertain, there can be so much satisfaction in checking tasks off a list. Don't fall into this trap. Here are some examples of this. Spending too much time optimizing paperwork or on licensing, incorporation, equity. This is not an area where you need to optimize or innovate. Just follow the standard advice to stay legal and compliant. Slightly cheaper workers' comp insurance or a slightly better equity structure is not going to make or break your business. Taking meetings with potential investors, advisors, partners, or building cool, hard features that you don't know people want yet. Again, these things can make you feel really good and really smart. Solving hard problems is awesome. Unfortunately, it's not going to help you find product market fit sooner. It's just going to be things you're checking off a list. The second mental trap I want to talk about is that sometimes you can fool yourself into thinking something is working when it's really not. Be honest with yourself. It doesn't feel good to admit to yourself or your teammates or your investors or your mom that things aren't going well. But you're not doing yourself any favors by not diagnosing problems early and often. Slow growth can be deceptive. It's easy to mistake slow growth for product market fit. As someone that's worked at both kind of slow, steady growth companies, my own startups, and companies with clear product market fit, like DoorDash, trust me, you guys, these types of growth feel fundamentally different. Third trap I want to talk about is perfectionism or indecision blocking progress. When nothing seems to be working, it's really easy to make every decision feel like it's going to make or break your company. In reality, most decisions don't matter. And for the ones that do, it's okay to decide wrong first and then fix it later. Just keep moving. So the best case scenario, the one you can put on a pedestal, is a scenario where you make the right decision quickly every time. This is completely impossible. No one's going to achieve this. I recommend the second best option, which is to make pretty good decisions quickly. And then if they turn out to be wrong, fail, learn, and switch to what's working quickly. As a startup founder, you have dozens of decisions to make every day. Don't waste time on the ones that won't help you get to product market fit. Remember, if it's a tough call, it actually probably means you can't go wrong. So pick one, keep moving. The fourth mental trap I want to talk about is spending too much time on downside protection instead of chasing upside. Downside protection is straightforward and satisfying. Fixing little problems is very easy, but rarely where the innovation happens. Chasing upside requires risk-taking, creativity, a lot of false starts. So get in as many iterations as you can. For example, we hear a lot of ops teams talking about getting themselves out of spreadsheets. Y'all, at this stage, spreadsheets are fine until they're not. If they're working, stick with them. It's good to do things that don't scale as long as they're not breaking. Instead, spend your time finding out what your users need in order to use your product every day instead of once a week. That's the upside chasing that we're talking about. The last trap I want to call out today is chipping away at small problems when there's a big existential one looming that maybe you don't want to face. For example, you may tell yourself, hey, my 150 users are asking for one-click ordering. Let me go build it. You guys, you only have 150 users. This is a problem. Maybe you've only had 150 users for the past 3 months and they're starting to churn and no one new is signing up. That's your biggest problem. Go solve that. So here's a quick recap on prioritization. You'll never get to everything on your task list. You have to use KPIs to prioritize your work and only work on the biggest blocker to your primary KPI. And be honest with yourself and fail fast. So now let's talk about how to choose the right KPIs. Remember, we can't afford to waste time running fast in the wrong direction. Let's define primary and secondary KPIs. Your primary KPI or primary metric is the main metric you use to measure whether your business is on track. For the vast majority of startups, your primary KPI should be growth and ideally revenue growth. This indicates that you've built something people want and you're on track to building a huge business. As we've mentioned, there are a few exceptions to this. For example, maybe a marketplace business might choose signups or GMV as their primary KPI, or an early enterprise business with a long sales cycle might choose letters of intent. Secondary KPIs are things that need to be tracked, moving in the right direction to make sure you're not cheating on your primary KPI or to give you an early signal when your primary KPI is very lagging. Here's some examples of secondary KPIs. Retention and churn. These are going to actually contribute to your revenue growth, so they're very important to track. Unit economics. You need to make sure you're making money on each user and not giving away free money and calling it growth. Customer acquisition cost. Depending on your stage, you may not need to optimize this right now. Just have a sense for your payback period and whether you'll make or lose money per customer acquired. Keep this list small and relevant. 3 to 5 secondary KPIs is reasonable. I've also included a short list here of vanity metrics. As we discussed earlier, it is very easy, even for good founders, to fall into the trap of prioritizing for these metrics. They feel good and they provide external validation. If you find these creeping into your task list, just ask yourself, is this directly on my path to revenue growth? Is this my biggest blocker? To illustrate what a laser focus on growth looks like, I dug up some examples. Here's a side-by-side comparison of DoorDash on demo day, which everyone knows, and my own startup, Rickshaw, which was also a delivery platform. We went through YC right after DoorDash did, and DoorDash eventually acquired Rickshaw in 2017. You'll see above that both companies had a laser focus on order volume as a top-line metric. This allowed for clear, focused execution and resulted in strong and very similar early traction. However, post-demo day, the paths diverged a little bit. Rickshaw had a bit of trouble fundraising, despite comparable early traction to DoorDash. This caused us to make a decision out of fear. And instead of continuing to have a clear focus on top-line growth, as DoorDash did, we tried to optimize for both growth and unit economics. We tried to hedge, and this was very dangerous. This split focus put us in a weird no man's land of slow growth, which, as we described before, can kill startups. There is a lot more nuance about profitability versus growth that I won't get into here. The main message today is to choose your primary KPIs and don't try to get smart and optimize for 2 or more hard things at once. If you want to hear more about profitability versus growth, I actually did a short video on this already, and it'll be linked in the Zoom chat for you to watch later. So now that we've talked about how to define primary and secondary KPIs, how do we set targets? Assuming growth is your primary KPI, how much growth is enough? This depends on your business and your stage, but in Paul Graham's classic essay about growth, he notes that for a company going through YC, 5 to 7% week over week growth is good, and a 10% week over week growth is exceptional. As I've said a few times now, small changes in weekly or monthly growth rate really compound and make a difference in the long run. So early growth is better than late growth if you can choose. That number on your bathroom mirror per the Airbnb story reminds you to focus on this early. Here are a few factors that might impact your growth rate that you might want to keep in mind. First, latent demand might boost early growth. Perhaps some early users will be willing to put up with an inferior product experience because you're solving an urgent need. But that growth rate might be tougher to sustain later. For enterprise businesses, the length of your sales cycle might be long. This should go down over time, but it might impact early KPI and goal setting. In these cases, you can set goals around other process metrics, for example, leads in different stages of your funnel. Another thing that might be impacting your growth rate is whether you're doing organic or paid user acquisition. Early on, organic is ideal. You should know where to find your first few passionate users and talk to them directly, and ideally have them spread the word. You can also run paid acquisition tests so that once you have a product that's growing organically and a sense for payback period, you can crank up the ad spend to drive growth. But please don't do this too early and don't leak money on this strategy accidentally. The last thing I want to talk about on this slide is retention and engagement. We get a common question. Should we focus on getting new users or focus on retaining our existing users? The short answer to this is you have to do both. The slightly longer, nuanced answer is that both will impact your revenue growth. So get a sense for which one's going to have more impact. First, make sure you don't have a problem with churn and that your users are sticking around long enough to pay back their acquisition cost and to tell their friends. You don't want to bring new customers into a substandard product. But beyond that, of course, focus on bringing in new users. Ultimately, both these metrics will need to be strong to sustain a healthy revenue growth. To share another example from Super Daily, early on, they realized that the acquisition numbers they were tracking were not reflecting a healthy growing business and could be artificially boosted due to paid promos. To protect against this, they switched their track metric from signups, which was too easy to game, to tracking customers who'd placed 5 or more orders, since they saw this as a leading indicator to customers that were very likely to become long-term revenue-generating customers. This helped the Super Daily teams align their marketing and their overall revenue goals to chase top-line revenue growth. When setting targets, there are 2 possible approaches, and you can and actually should do both. Your first option is a top-down approach. Set a goal or a milestone that you need to reach sometime in the future. For example, $5,000 in MRR by the end of startup school. Back into that weekly growth rate that you need to achieve that longer-term goal. The Airbnb demo day example is a great example of this. Set a target and obsess over it. Compounding matters, so getting an early start helps a lot. Your second option is a bottoms-up approach. Ask yourself, what do you think is realistic for you to get done in the next week? Then you can project out from there. As a thought exercise, when doing a bottoms-up goal setting, you can ask yourself, what could we achieve with unlimited funding? A lot of people in their heads think that funding is a bottleneck, so let's remove that. What could we do in the next week with unlimited money or resources? Then ask yourself, what creative ways can we still achieve that even with limited funding? Set your goal. Super Daily has an awesome example of using this bottoms-up approach that actually led to a key insight. After doing this thought exercise of what they would do with unlimited funding, they concluded that to grow, the main thing they needed to do was activate more apartment complexes. And suddenly they realized that money wasn't actually the big bottleneck. Rather, they needed to create a repeatable operational process to activate these apartment complexes. This type of goal setting led to more focused problem solving and execution. Between top down and bottom up, either is actually fine. I recommend periodically doing both to see whether what you're doing is realistic, achievable, and ambitious at the same time. Just make sure that you're checking to make sure that you're always on track to build a big business and aren't accidentally ending up in that no man's land of underwhelming but consistent growth. Let's talk a little bit more about some non-revenue KPIs that may be tempting, but not always right. First, CAC to LTV ratio. You might hear these buzzwords together. These are generally concerns kind of later in your business, but they usually come post product market fit once you have a fundamental business that you know people want, and then you need to reliably scale your user base. So for now, we recommend you only worry about payback period. Ideally, your payback period is zero, as in $0 spent on CAC, so customers are profitable on day one. If you do need to spend on CAC or on paid acquisition, get a sense for how quickly users pay back that CAC and whether you're reliably hitting it. Does your retention rate make this work? LTV can really be a rabbit hole for early stage companies, and it's really hard to calculate. So just make sure your payback period is reasonable and you're making money per user. A second tempting KPI I want to talk about is free signups or daily active users. I'll start by saying this. Paying customers will have very different expectations for a product than free customers will. So if you plan to charge for your product eventually, don't mess around getting feedback from free customers. It'll likely be the wrong feedback. Get paid from day one, or at least don't count those users as part of your growth. The main exception here is for marketplaces or products that have a strong network effect and need volume in order to have utility. Uber is a great example of this. Without enough drivers on the platform, the user experience was not good enough for riders to pay a premium for. In these cases, signups or GMV can sometimes suffice if no revenue is being generated yet. I have a couple of stories of startups spending too much time on signups and shifting to revenue too late in the game. Scribd was an early YC company that went through in summer 2006. They spent their first 4 years primarily growing a free product, and they were afraid of losing their millions of customers if they started charging. As you can see in this graph, in year 5, so remember they started in 2006, in mid-2010, they started charging. And while they did lose over 90% of their customers, their revenue grew by infinity percent. They finally had a business. And while Scribd already had millions of users, it wasn't until they started charging that they started to really learn what their paying users wanted. I want to talk about JamGlue, my first startup. Coincidentally, we also went through YC in summer 2006 with Scribd. We had a thriving community of several million content creators using a free product. It wasn't until our Series A term sheet fell through at the 11th hour and we were completely out of cash that we had to switch our primary KPI to revenue out of necessity. As soon as we did this, revenue growth rapidly picked up and it made us default alive. We wished we'd started generating revenue sooner so we could have taken advantage of those compounding effects when we needed them most. Quick note on this. So both these companies were founded in 2006. It was a different era. Like revenue wasn't cool yet, but the same lessons still apply and can still be applied today. I want to quickly talk about a few exceptions, other exceptions to revenue KPIs. And this is hardware companies, biotech companies, enterprise businesses with a long sales cycle. In these businesses, it can be more challenging to measure growth. And in these cases, something like letters of intent, contracts, maybe even technical milestones might be reasonable metrics. But please keep yourself honest and make sure that these are actually indicators of actual progress and growth and audit them frequently. So I want to summarize what we learned today. First, You always want to move fast, but make sure you're moving in the right direction. Here are some key notes about prioritization. You will never get to everything on your task list. You need to use KPIs to prioritize your work and only work on the biggest blocker to your primary KPI. Be honest with yourself and fail fast. Here are our best practices for setting KPIs. Your primary KPI should probably be revenue growth unless there are exceptional circumstances. Secondary KPIs are important to track, but not necessary to optimize just yet. In the early days, be laser focused on your primary KPI and use both scalable and unscalable tactics to move that metric. Now, I challenge each of you. At the end of this talk, you should each write down your primary and secondary KPIs and set ambitious targets that you need to hit by the end of July. Next, audit your task list for the week and make sure you are laser focused on hitting those goals. I know a lot of you are in Slack and WhatsApp groups for Startup School. I encourage you to share your KPIs and your goals with your community and get feedback and hold yourselves accountable. I hope this talk helps at least one of you get to product market fit faster. We'll now open it up to Q&A, and I'd love to hear any questions you have about your own company's KPIs.
All right. Thank you, Divya. That was awesome. For
Thanks,
those
Jared.
of you who didn't catch the hint that Divya dropped at the end, both Divya and I started companies in 2006, 16 years ago, and we did not take the advice that Divya gave in this talk. We did not focus on growing a KPI, and we did not focus on charging our users early and making revenue our KPI. So the advice in this talk is drawn from our hard-won lessons of not doing what Divya said.
And thanks, Jared, for letting us air both of our dirty laundry on this talk to provide a concrete example.
All right, let's take a couple of questions from the audience. I've got two good ones from Slido here. So the first one is, Divya, if I haven't launched yet, how do I interpret the advice in this presentation? How do I think about KPIs and prioritization if I haven't launched my MVP?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So we see a lot of pre-launch companies, and the main thing you need to be doing prior to launch is, one, talking to users and getting as much clarity as you can on whether, what you're building is something that people are going to want. So, we say that you don't really know until you've launched, and that's true. But the more you can de-risk that through user conversations, the better. So there's usually two KPIs that we see for pre-launch companies. One is conversations with users and how many users you've spoken to. And again, the quality of those conversations matters. And the second one might be time till launch, or maybe some, technical milestones that stand in the way of launch. Just make sure those technical milestones are things you heard from your users. But again, once you do launch, please switch your KPIs to growth or revenue growth.
Okay. And the second question is, when I'm prioritizing, how do I balance spending time building my product versus talking to users to figure out what to build?
Yeah, so this is going to be one of those annoying answers, which is you have to do both. One kind of paradigm that I've seen is that a lot of the best founders we see at YC thrive on responding to customer support emails. They love it. Sometimes there's a bucket of founders that can't wait to outsource support, and they can't wait to hire somebody to do support. The best founders, it's one of the last things they let go, because customer support is building your product. It's creating a fantastic product experience, and it gives you kind of that first line of, it gives you that direct view into what your customers want. And so if somebody who's building the product is responding, hearing customer complaints and responding to them right away, that's usually the right way to kind of combine those two things.
I love that answer. That is such a great insight about how the best founders love doing customer support. That is 100% true in my experience. All right. Thank you, Divya. That was awesome.
Thanks, Jared. This was fun.
Okay, so for most people here, these talks should have given you some immediately actionable things to do. If you haven't launched, you should write down the spec for your MVP, just like Michael said. And if you have launched, you should start tracking your goals like Divya explained. And as a reminder, Startup School actually has a goal tracking system built in that is designed to help you do exactly the process that Divya recommended. And here's where it lives. Another procedural note, while we don't send out full recordings of these talks, we will be sending out the slide decks presented most of the time. We will send these out in the weekly roundup emails that we send each week on Thursday. So look out for the links to the slide decks then. Okay, coming up on Wednesday, we have Aaron Epstein giving a talk about startup business models and how to price your product. And I'm really excited about this talk. I just saw the slides over the weekend because it's really the first time that YC has ever publicly shared a bunch of really important advice that we give to the companies that we invest in. Some of the things he's going to talk about include why some business models suck and you probably shouldn't pick them, and the most common mistakes founders make when setting prices and charging for their product. So that's it for today. We will see you back here on Wednesday.